Good afternoon and welcome to the Leadership Learning Webinar Series. This series provides monthly learning on relevant business topics like today's topic, Leadership Derailers. Do you know what's holding you back? I'm Natalie Crotto, Program Manager for the Corporate Learning Solutions Group at Lake Forest Graduate School of Management. We at Lake Forest Graduate School of Management are proud to be hosting today's program. Lake Forest is an independent, accredited institution with over 50 years' experience at providing practical business leader education. This education comes in the form of graduate business degrees, certificate programs, and targeted training and development through our Corporate Learning Solutions programs. Corporate Learning Solutions specializes in developing corporate managers and leaders by combining relevant content with the expertise of our business leader faculty to provide customized training, consultation, coaching, and organizational development services to our corporate clients. We are grateful for the sponsorship and generosity of our client and longtime supporter of the school, Trustmark and the Trustmark Foundation. Trustmark provides access to a full spectrum of flexible benefit solutions, including health plan administration for self-funded employer groups, payroll-deducted voluntary products, group medical benefits, and health and fitness management programs. We are able to bring this webinar to you on a complimentary basis as a result of Trustmark's support. Before we move into today's program, I'd like to take a moment to go over how we will interact today. During the program, you will be invited to participate using polls and chat. If you have questions or comments during the program, please submit those through the chat feature. Please be sure you are muted and that your video is off for the entire program. That will help us avoid unnecessary distractions during the program. Now I would like to hand it over to Jeff Anderson, our facilitator for today.
Thank you, Natalie. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. The objective of today is to talk a little bit about a subject that I've been speaking on for many years, leadership derailment, and in particular to give each of you the opportunity at the end of the session to walk away with some insight into what your unique derailment risks might be. I would say, just apologize in advance, I have a little remnants from a little bit of cold, so I will try not to cough into the telephone here, but please, I apologize in advance. So the first thing I want to do is start with a little bit of a definition. I've been told by many of my friends who speak languages other than English that in many languages there isn't even a translation for the word derail or derailment. So I put this up, and I particularly like the second part of the definition, where we think about derailment as obstructing the progress of something. You can imagine that can happen in careers. I unfortunately have seen that too often, where the careers of talented people get obstructed by some unique risks that they have. I've also seen it obstruct the progress of organizations. So I spent the day yesterday, for example, with the CEO of a very successful middle market manufacturing company, and the unique risks of that leader are actually obstructing the progress of the business and causing him unnecessary distress in his life. So that's a little bit of derailment in what we're going to talk about today. So the first thing you might ask is why? Of all the subjects that we could spend some time chatting with each other about over lunch today, why talk about derailment? And the first reason is, unfortunately, failure and management failure is all too prevalent. So I thought let's do a little experiment here. So what I'd like you to do is take a minute, and I just want you to think about and add up, make an estimate of the total number of people that you have worked for in your professional career. So take a second and come up with a guess. Think back over your whole career. You don't need to be exact. Come up with an estimate. Step two, then, is I want you to think of, out of that total number of people you have worked for in your career, how many of them would you not want to work for again? So now we have two numbers. And then we're going to do a little math here. Based on those two numbers, I'd just like you to calculate a rough percentage of the people you have worked for that you would not want to work for again. And then what I want to do is we're going to launch a little poll here. And I'd just like you to respond to that poll. Where is your answer along that continuum of from 0 to 100%? And we'll see what kind of answers we get there. Take a second and poll in your response. We're going to give you about another 30 seconds to poll in your answer. I'm curious what our aggregate experience is. Okay. Let's see what the group at large has to say. A lot of data to crunch, it appears. So there we see that 66 out of 243 people who are participating, 0 to 20%, 21 to 40% about another 60, 40 to 60% about 35, and so on. This is actually a better result than I get with most audiences I speak to. But we're still in the predominantly 20 to 40% of the bosses that we have all worked for we'd not want to work for again. Curiously, it's actually something that has been studied quite a bit in the world of academia. And I just sort of popped up a number of different studies that have defined failure of management in different ways and used different methodologies. But the average, no matter how we cut it, ends up suggesting that about half of all managers, quote, fail, unquote, at some point in their career. So it sort of reinforces both your experience in this research, reinforces that this issue of failure is all around us, and it's certainly costly to organizations. The second reason I like to talk about derailment is because there's a guy at the University of Minnesota, Louis Quast, who's done a lot of research to show that just knowing your risks without even consciously making any behavioral changes significantly reduces the risk that they will get in your way at some point during your career. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, achieving awareness is really difficult. There's a gentleman named David Dunning at Cornell who's the leading researcher on self-assessment probably in the world, or self-awareness in the world. And he wrote a famous paper where his hypothesis that he proved was that the deficiency we have that makes us bad at something makes it also impossible for us on our own to know how bad we are. Or said another way, a colleague of mine recently said that you can't know yourself by yourself. And so some kind of external intervention is essential for us to have an accurate view of what our risks are and then be able to mitigate them going forward. So that's the why derailment. What I'd like to do is take a minute, though, and I want you to think back to those bosses that you said you would never want to work for again. And take a minute here and chat in. What is it about those bosses? What is it about their behavior, their attributes, their background, etc., that would make you not want to work for them again? So I think we want everyone to chat to all participants. Right. You're seeing them like me pop in here, right? Micromanagement pops up often. Poor communication pops up often. Selfish. I just said to Natalie, probably should have built a word cloud here to try to capture all of these challenging things. Narcissist, condescending, lack of support, micromanagement again, right? I think it's just interesting to sort of watch as these things fly in here, the common experience and patterns that exist within people that we've all experienced. His paychecks bounced. That was a unique one, whoever chatted that one in. So I think we can all sort of see the pattern. The interesting thing is that this is one of the most widely studied areas in leadership. It was started almost 50 years ago, originally by the Center for Creative Leadership, but has been replicated by many institutions. And what they do is they go into organizations that hire large cohorts of people all at the same time. And then they follow that group for long periods of time, usually 15 to 20 years. And at the end of every year, they go in and they talk to the organization and they ask, who is it that was passed over for promotion or may have been terminated or got poor performance reviews or in some way or another sort of fell off the train, or as we said earlier, something got in the way of the progress that they had been making. And then they go around and collect data from their colleagues and they compile that data and they develop some patterns around what are the things that really do get in their way. And if you look across all of those major studies, the curious thing is the same 7 or so factors show up every single time. And this is a list of what those are, and they should look remarkably similar to the things that you chatted in a moment or two ago. Poor emotional control, integrity, or said differently, consistency issues, the difficulty building and leading a team, problems with relationships, most often with peers, but often with subordinates, a perspective that is too narrow. There's our friend micromanagement. And then finally, the failure to adapt as in new situations or as circumstances change. What I think is interesting are two things that are not on the list, which we could have a long conversation with. Technical knowledge is not on the list. I think because our standard interviewing and assessment techniques allow us to ascertain someone's level of technical competence pretty quickly. The other thing that's not on the list, maybe more interesting, is failure to get results. And I'm not here to say that people, particularly senior executives, don't get fired for failing to achieve results. They do. It's clearly not the most common reason. And I would suggest that these factors are what lead to the failure to get the results that they had hoped for. So the question that I think is most interesting is, if the same results are derived from every study, and they line up so well with your own experience, where do these things come from? And I just want you to pause and think about that question for a minute. What's the source, what's the root cause of these behaviors? There's a gentleman, Robert Hogan. Some of you may know him. He started a well-known assessment organization, Hogan Assessments, who wrote a really interesting paper many years ago on management derailment. And his hypothesis, which I concur with, is that at the core, these issues are a function of our personality. That each of us have, in addition to the normal personality we walk around with, have an aspect of our personality that in the right situations, with the right amount of stress added in, there are aspects that can come out in ways that are not helpful to us. Mr. Hogan went on and designed an interesting instrument that can be used to try to get at some of these behaviors, but unfortunately, while it's scientifically solid, much of it is hard to track back to the 7 real-life business risks that we talked about a couple of slides ago. So what I've done is design my own little mini assessment using some of the best things that I've taken away from psychological assessments, as well as my own experience working with leaders over the last 20 years. And what I want to do over the next few minutes is walk through that assessment with each of you so that you have an opportunity to score yourself and identify what your individual risks are. So what I need you to do is take out a blank piece of paper, and you're going to draw a continuum like this. We're going to talk about each of the factors, so you're going to place yourself on the continuum for each of the 7 primary derailment risks. The left side of the scale is low risk. The right side of the scale is high risk. For each factor, I'm going to go through a series of statements or questions for you to think about yourself, and it will tell you whether your answer pushes you more to the left side of the scale or more to the right side of the scale. Let's work through one. I think it'll be clearer after we do the first one. So number 1, the first risk, as you remember, was poor emotional control. So if you are often irritated by the faults of others, if when people fail to meet commitments or the quality of the work that they do gets under your skin in a hurry, that would tend to push you to the right side of the scale or say this might be a higher risk for you. Likewise, if you are known to have outward expressions of your stress or disappointment, if you pound on the table or yell or throw chairs or whatever might be the case, that clearly puts you to the right side and a little higher risk. And then finally, if you don't have those outward expressions, but the people who work with you would notice the changes in your mood or consider your behaviors at times to be unpredictable, that would also push you further to the right side of the curve. So what I want you to do is take a quick second based on those inputs and put an X somewhere on the curve for poor emotional control for you. And then we'll move on and do the second, and so forth. Number 2, I just happened to look down at the screen a second ago, and I could see that someone chatted in that they wouldn't want to work for their boss because they were a bad dresser, which I appreciate the humor there. The second risk was integrity and consistency issues. And again, I wouldn't necessarily anchor too much on integrity because none of us, I'm sure, on this WebEx have integrity issues. Think of it more as people might experience you as inconsistent. So the first factor to think about is, do you enjoy, and the emphasis on enjoy, going against the rules, challenging the status quo, shaking things up? That's going to push you a little to the right side of the issue. Full disclosure, this is a risk for me. I clearly enjoy pushing the envelope and shaking things up. My colleagues here in the room are smiling. Would others describe you as competitive and ambitious? That also would push you to the right side or higher risk side of the scale. On the other hand, if it's difficult for you to change your mind once you've made it up, you're not as malleable or subject to peer pressure, that's likely to make you a lower risk for this variable. So take a second and put an X somewhere where you think this risk lies for you. Number 3, difficulty building and leading a team. Do you like being in the spotlight? Probably pushes you to the right side of the scale. Do you readily and without prodding seek alternative opinions, share credit, gather people around when you have something that you want to talk about or need input on? That's going to push you to the lower risk or left side. And finally, sort of a combo question. When you are interacting with others, what is it that you prefer in that relationship? Harmony, the left side of the continuum, or directness, the right side of the continuum? So take a second, again, and score yourself somewhere on that line that you drew on your little scorecard. Next item. Relationship issues. This is I will tell you, in my almost 20 years now working with senior executives, this is the second most prevalent derailment risk that I encounter, particularly as people who have relationship challenges with their peers in an organization. So do you prefer to work alone or socialize in small groups? Probably on the right side of things. How would others describe you? Confident and competitive, higher risk on the right, or modest and cooperative, lower risk, left? Are you extremely confident in your views and opinions? Right side of the scale. And the final question, which I would put the most weight on, if I were to interview your people who work most often with you and your colleagues, would they describe you as warm and likable? And if the answer to that is a resounding yes, then that's going to push you more to the left side of the scale. So again, as we've done each time, I know you have the hang of it now. Mark a little X somewhere on that continuum for you, for that particular factor. Next, narrow perspective. Do the details of things matter a lot to you? So if you're looking at this and you're saying, I don't like the font or colors that Jeff is using in this presentation, if that thought even popped into your mind, that's probably suggesting you're on the right side of that scale somewhere. Do you have a wide variety of interests? If I was to look at your playlists or go to wherever you store the materials you like to read, would it be a wide variety of things or a deep and fairly narrow selection of things? If it's a wide variety, it's going to push you to the left side. And then, how curious are you about how things work? If you're very curious, it's going to push you to the left. In a lot of personality assessment instruments, they'll ask a question something like, I know why stars twinkle. And a lot of people will say, yeah, I do know. I'm curious about it. I've investigated. I've read it. And then there are slugs like me who don't know and don't have an interest in knowing. And that's actually a pretty strong indication of a personality preference on this scale. So as we've done before, take a moment, put your X somewhere down on the line. As was the case with what you chatted in, this is the issue that I see most often in the business world and holds people back most often. And I see it at all levels of organizations. The CEO I mentioned earlier that I was with yesterday, this is his challenge, trying to away from and not need to know every detail of everything that was going on everywhere in his organization every day. So to assess this risk, 3 questions. Number 1, do you think sometimes does it just seem like it's quicker and easier for me just to do it myself, and so that's what I do? That's on the right side. Would other people describe you as a perfectionist? That's going to suggest you're on the right or higher risk side of this particular variable. And interestingly, do you easily and quickly trust others? If the answer to that is yes, it pushes you to the left side. When I've worked with executives, often their tendency to micromanage gets to a core trust issue and how quickly and easily they can just let go and trust other people and fully empower them. That's why that question is included in the list. Excuse me. All right, take a moment, put your X down. We're almost there, last one. Failure to adapt. So if I were to go around and poll your colleagues, would they describe you as spontaneous and flexible and comfortable in and enjoying in ambiguity? And if the answer is yes, then that's going to push you to the left side of this scale. When you think about change, does it stress you or energize you? And how would others describe you in terms of your listening skills? Are you a good listener, or might you be a not so good or at least an impatient listener? So take a moment, put your final X there. And then what we want to do is another, is it a poll, Natalie?
Yeah.
We're going to have a poll. What we want to do is we want to get let me back up. When I've done this with other audiences and I walk around and I look at people's scorecards, we sometimes will identify that we're right of center on a variable, but we're probably not capturing often what our real risk is. We're sort of mitigating or downplaying it. Every one of us has at least one of these that's high risk. So I'd encourage you to take a really honest look at your scorecard there. And then what I want you to do is let's have a little poll. I'm curious which of these is the most prominent risk for the people who are in attendance right now. So figure out which one is your highest risk and respond to the poll. We'll keep it open for around a minute or so. How are we doing, Natalie?
We're doing good. We'll give it a few more seconds.
A few more seconds?
Close it, and then it'll analyze it. That'll take a few seconds.
All right, we're analyzing. Thanks for sticking with us.
About 10 seconds left.
All right. So it looks like we have what I would call essentially a tie between poor emotional control, narrow perspective, and micromanagement. Interesting. Maybe what we should benefit from if we talked about those top 3 in particular, and some of what the advice that I give leaders I work with who are challenged on some of these fronts, and sort of how to work on them, or how to take action to mitigate them, right? The first one, poor emotional control. Most often, that's a deeply rooted personality variable, obviously, and regulating that requires a lot of conscious energy to be tuned into our moods and how we are responding to things and to sort of have self-talk to control it. In order to do that, one of the most important enablers is the pace at which we operate. And in some ways, that applies across this whole spectrum of risks. Oftentimes, when I do this presentation, I'll include a video I didn't include today of a golf tournament I was watching a few years ago. On Sunday, the final day, and well-known golfer Phil Mickelson was coming up the final hole of the final day, and he had hit his shot onto the green, and if he makes the putt, he's going to win the tournament, and the people surrounding the course in the gallery were going crazy, and they were cheering for him. And one of the television commentators came on and said, you know, he's only thinking about two things right now, and it's the rate of his breathing and the pace at which he's walking. And the other television commentator said, yes, Tom Watson, another famous golfer, said that he never learned how to win until he learned how to control his breathing. And if you look, you will see that there's dozens of research studies dedicated to how effectively professional athletes are able to control their physiological response to stressful times. But unfortunately, we don't teach that in the business world, but it's just as applicable. That if we can slow ourselves down, walk more slowly between meetings, particularly high-stakes, stressful ones, the likelihood that you'll be able to control your emotional reactions is much higher. Micromanagement. Unfortunately, it's a widespread disease among business leaders. In many of our organizations, the culture exacerbates that tendency that exists in many of us because there's at least, we've convinced ourselves that it's important that we know what is going on in every corner of our organization, that we be able to respond to questions. And I've learned that it takes real courage in many of these organizations to be able to say, you know, I'm not really close to that. Let's bring in Barb, who manages that every day, and she can give you the update on the status of those things. For many of you, that may have made your heart jump a little bit when I suggested that. But being able to do that and fully trust others is not always easy in the organizations we operate in. I often will advise leaders that it's a matter of scale for you, that learning how to do this is what allows you to grow and take on more responsibility. One very practical tip I will give you in the form of a story. I was with a senior leader a few weeks ago, and I was watching her have a one-on-one meeting with her team member. And she was going down the list she had of all the important assignments her team member had to get status. When the meeting was done, the team member left, and we started to talk, and she stopped and she said, well, you had a chance to see me in action. What did you think? And my response was, why do you have the list? Why doesn't your teammate have the list? Why isn't it her responsibility to keep track of the important assignments that she has, to update you in terms of what you need to know, to ask for your input, advice, and decisions where they're necessary? And that frees you up to think about only the two most important things that you want to make sure you're covered. And if you can get your mind around making it the other person's responsibility to track and know those details, you're on the right path. Finally, narrow perspective. I think that's a function of the fact that each of us started our career in some discipline, operations, finance, marketing, sales, whatever, and early on we are rewarded and promoted for our mastery of that particular technical discipline. And so it's reinforced that behavior that causes us to focus very deeply in an area of expertise. And we don't spend as much time thinking across organizational boundaries until we get into a position that demands that. So I would encourage you, if this is something that you want and need to work on, to force yourself to ask yourself questions about how other people from other disciplines in your organization would think about or respond to the same question. And that'll begin your efforts to mitigate that risk. So if I have piqued your interest at all in any of these topics, the school has developed a proprietary business model, and you can see as illustrated here, many of these risks, all of these risks at some point line up very carefully with the aspects of the model as we've articulated them: agility, innovation, strategic vision, self-awareness, and engaging others. So if you want to dive in more to help understand your risks and how to mitigate them, there's many options we have. Each of the next monthly webinars will be dedicated to one of these aspects of the model. So that's an opportunity for you to dive in more deeply. Second, there may be some of you who are out there who are actually interested in a MBA, and we'd be happy to talk to you through our admissions colleagues, and our curriculum is built around this model. So there's plenty of opportunities to dive into this in more detail. And then finally, we have announced many weeks ago a unique open enrollment with CRAIN'S Chicago Business, which begins in about 3 weeks. And that entire program, 6 sessions, is dedicated to the model that I just showed you and will address each of the risks accordingly. So with that, everyone knows me around here as someone who's always running ahead of schedule and is brief. I hope we gave you some individual insights. Happy to answer questions offline if we can be helpful as you process these. What was that, Natalie? Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's a question that came through.
We have a question that came through.
Jeff, how do you find your risk? I have X's all over the place.
Great question. So if you didn't come away with clarity, I would find 2 people you trust. If you have a significant other, ask him or her to score you independently on these things, or a trusted colleague in the workplace that you're comfortable having this conversation with. I guarantee you they'll look at that list and be able to help you understand which one is your prominent risk. Question is, can we get CPE credit for the seminars? I'm assuming for the future webinars. I don't know the answer to that. We'll look into that. Thank you. Can we get copies of the slides?
We will send out the recording with a PDF of the slides.
Yeah, so we'll send out a recording with a PDF of the slides. Hopefully I've given you some insight. We appreciate you taking the time over lunch to spend with us. Have a great afternoon. Natalie, back to you.
Thank you, Jeff. We hope you've gotten some good information on Leadership Derailers. Today's program was part of the Leadership Learning Webinar Series delivered to you by Lake Forest Graduate School of Management, This program was made possible by our sponsor, the Trustmark Foundation. Again, our deepest thanks for their support. We value your feedback. Please click on the link in the chat to answer a brief survey. We use the information from these surveys to continually improve our sessions. We also will be sending the recording along with a PDF of the slides out over the next couple of days. And as Jeff mentioned, please check the LFGSM events calendar for our future webinars. With that, we'd like to end the session and wish you a productive rest of your day. Thank you.